Welcome back. Wells Fargo stock moving higher this morning after the Federal Reserve Board announced it was lifting a cap on the firm's assets that had been put in place all the way back in 2018 in the wake of the bank's unauthorized account scandal. Senator Elizabeth Warren, in a statement calling the decision by the Federal Reserve Board, quote, an outrageous giveaway to one of Wall Street's most derelict banks, adding Wells Fargo has a long history of violating the law and there's no evidence that it has changed. Well, here's what the CEO of Wells Fargo, Charlie Scharf, said last hour on CNBC when asked if he had spoken to Senator Warren and other critics.
I try and talk to everyone on both sides of the aisle. And by the way, I understand criticisms that people have had about us in the past. In fact, I would agree with many of the criticisms. What I hope is that they would look at the work that's been completed, the independent work done by the regulators, again, the majority of which, and the conclusions likely reached under a Democratic administration, and say, this is the way it should work. The regulators actually at this point should be congratulated for driving the fix. I mean, I and the management team did a lot of work, but they're the ones that drove this and were the ones that oversaw this and made sure that we and our board were doing all the things that we should have done.
Joining us now, first on CNBC, Senator Elizabeth Warren. She's the ranking member of the Banking Committee. Senator Warren, good morning. It's good to have you.
Good morning. Good to be with you.
Why not just take the win? I mean, this was a harsh punishment that encapsulated the better part of a decade, identifying the problem and systematically fixing it.
Well, if they had systematically fixed it, then I'd be happy to take the win. But in fact, every member of the Fed should be embarrassed by what they've just done. Look at Wells Fargo's record. You remember what happened 7 years ago when they get caught in a scandal that is so terrible, it in fact involves criminal penalties. And they set up their whole business operation around cheating their own customers and cheating their investors, and they got caught. So they end up with this penalty that there's going to be a cap on how much growth they can engage in. And what do? Do they clean up operations and say, that's it, we're never going to break the law again? Nope. Not only have they continued to break the law, look how recently they have done it. In January of this year, the SEC tagged them for scamming their own investors. In December of just last year, what would that be, 6 months ago, the CFPB tags them for more than $800 million scam involving Zelle and their customers. And then last September, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency tags them for money laundering. And as if all three agencies tagging them for serious violations of the law just in the last 9 months is not enough. In April of this year, just weeks ago, former and current Wells Fargo employees actually put out a report that said Wells is engaging in the same behavior that they were engaging in 7 years ago that started this whole cascade of law breaking, and that Wells Fargo hasn't really changed. I'd like to see Wells go just 1 year without a serious violation of the law before the Fed says, okay, we're good now.
Well, I mean, we could go one by one on all of those, but many of them were not consent orders and not related to the fake account scandal, which is what ultimately had them in the consent order. I'm just curious, Senator, have you read the 20,000, I'm told, pages of documents that they had to provide, not just to the Fed, but also to an independent verification on this that allowed them to get this consent order?
So that is the perfect question. And that is exactly what I have asked for. I want the Fed to give the Congress, the Banking Committee, 5 years of bank examination documents. I want to see what it is that Wells Fargo represented to the Fed and what the Fed asked Wells Fargo. Remember, the oversight job in Congress is both for these giant financial institutions, but it's also oversight over our regulatory agencies, including the Fed, to make sure that the Fed is doing its job. So that's what I'm calling for right now.
I think it's hard to release it to the Congress
so that we can read it.
I think it's hard to release to the Congress because I think there's probably a lot of proprietary, confidential information in there.
You can release it to the Banking Committee. We have a great deal of experience in dealing with confidential information and not leaking it. We've done it before. We can certainly do it
So
again.
are you saying you don't
part
trust the
of our
Fed?
oversight responsibilities. I want to see 5 years of bank examination reports from the Fed. I want to see how the Fed made the decision it made, given that Wells Fargo continues to break the law.
Vice Chair Barr, I mean, is someone that I think that you supported, and he's a tough cop on the banking beat. He led this. It was a unanimous decision by the Fed board. And again, just to go through some of the fixes, since you raised the question about the fixes, they did miss out on $9 billion of earnings a year, according to Bloomberg. They spent more than $2 billion a year on risk controls and completely refreshed their management team. I think 80% or more turnover on that front. And simplified their business by selling or closing 13 businesses. It's not like they were just marching in place waiting for this to end.
But notice what you're doing. You're saying engaged in lots of activities. What I'm looking at is stopped breaking the law. The point of engaging those activities is so you have appropriate safeguards in place so that you don't break the law. They get caught by the SEC, they get caught by the CFPB, they get caught by the OCC, the three big banking regulators breaking the law just within the last 9 months, plus a report from
They're
their
not the
own
only
employees.
ones. They're not. Cities had Bank of America. This is why they
We
are
need
heavily regulated.
Then we need oversight of all the banks, but
We have it.
particularly we need oversight of Wells Fargo, because even when it is under this kind of scrutiny, it still has engaged in activities where it has broken the law and done so repeatedly. That's a real problem with a big financial institution. And look, the problem with the Fed governors, I want to be clear, every single one of them should be embarrassed, whether they're Democratic appointees or Republican appointees, and that's why I want to see the bank examination reports. Show your homework to the Bank Oversight Committee in confidence so that we can see the decision that you made and what went into that decision and what changes Wells has actually made.
Is there a part of you, Senator, that would actually welcome a more robust competitor in credit cards or in wealth management or in commercial banking?
Yes, I would like to see a robust competitor who follows the law, yes. I think it is unfair to those who are in any business if they have to compete with people who cheat.
You say in your statement there's no evidence that it has changed. Have you engaged with the bank itself? Have you talked to management? Have you been inside of there?
I am open to speaking with anyone, but be clear about this. It is out there in public when they have broken the law, and their own employees and whistleblowers are saying they're engaging in the same activities that got them in trouble 7 years ago. I want to see how the Fed arrived at its conclusion.
I guess I'm just, from what I've been told, that you actually have not engaged with them. I mean, if you have such strong concerns about the management team, which is completely refreshed and has done a lot, I'm wondering why you won't meet with them.
I have expressed my concerns repeatedly and openly. And anyone who thinks I haven't expressed those concerns loudly enough, believe me, I am happy to repeat them again. Look, I'm open to meeting with anyone, but I don't want to hear a bunch of happy talk. I actually want to see the documents. I want to see what information was provided to the Fed that made the Fed, despite all of this public law-breaking activity, made the Fed to say, looks great, we're done here. I want to see what the Fed based that on.
The Fed and a Fed-approved independent third party, I would also note.
Well, fine. Then what's the problem with sharing it with the people whose legal responsibility is oversight of the regulators who are making this decision? Just show me your homework.
While we have you, I'd love to get your thoughts on this new CBO score and Elon Musk's commentary about this abomination, as he called it, and whether or not that moves the needle for some Senate moderates.
You know, look, you'd have to talk to the Senate moderates about what moves the needle for them. Right now, they seem to be fine with cutting health care access for 14 million Americans and cutting access to food. and pairing that with tax breaks for billionaires and millionaires. And look, I'm pretty straightforward about this. I don't think any little tiny baby ought to have to go without health care so Jeff Bezos can buy a third yacht. But I do believe that billionaires ought to be paying their fair share, and that failure to do that is a problem in our national debt, and it's a problem with this budget that the Republicans are moving forward. And it's just interesting to watch all kinds of different people come out of the woodwork, including your previous guest, say, you can't keep doing this. You can't hand out those kind of cuts to billionaires and still sustain the economy. That's going to create a problem for everyone. And look, here on Capitol Hill, the Republicans can do whatever nonsense they want to do and pretend that this is not going to cost money. But the reality is, and the markets know, that if you're not bringing in enough revenue to cover your expenses, that's going to be a real problem. And the bond market is starting to show that. So I'm very concerned about where the Republicans are driving this. They can't get where they want to be because they need magic math to be able to fix it. And you may be able to sell magic math on the floor of the United States Senate to the Republicans, but you can't sell magic math to the American people, and particularly to Wall Street and the bond markets.
So Democrats are deficit hawks now?
No, that's not the point. The point is that you cannot cut health care in America so that billionaires can get more tax breaks, so Mark Zuckerberg can buy another Hawaiian island. And you particularly can't do it when the giveaways to the billionaires are so ginormous. That is going to blow a hole in the United States budget. And that's what people are telling you from the left, from the right, from the center, from people who don't even like politics. And the Republicans in Congress can deny that, but that is the reality on the ground outside that building.
Just to put a final point on the Wells Fargo and just regulating banks in general, Senator Warren, a lot of folks in the banking system will say, okay, mistakes have been made, but the regulators are there. And actually what this is a really effective display of what it looks like to have pretty hardcore regulation that spans both Republican and Democrat administrations and also third-party regulators. And they're regulated on some of the issues you talked about as well that have happened since then. The question is, do you worry at all about the unintended consequences then of, it putting even more regulatory pressure on these banks, which are critical for our financial system, providing liquidity, providing loans? Do you want to see that in the hands of crypto firms or others that are less regulated?
I'm sorry, you're throwing a giant parade and tossing confetti over regulation that, let's see, what's happened in the last 9 months? Wells Fargo has been tagged for money laundering. It's been tagged for being engaged in consumer fraud, and it's been tagged for cheating its investors. Man, I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound like to me really tough oversight and a celebration of what a great job the oversight folks have done. They've caught Wells Fargo breaking the law over and over and over. And now everybody wants to celebrate that that's all behind us, and it'll be just fine to turn down the regulations on Wells Fargo. I just got to say, that makes no sense. But if the Fed has an argument to make here, then the Fed should release those banking examinations for 5 years to the banking committee and let us look at their homework.
All right. Senator Elizabeth Warren, thank you for coming on with your take.
You bet.
We appreciate it.